Hi, welcome to Newsbreak Chats. I'm Chai Hofelenia, and we've gathered this afternoon reporters who've written top stories under Newsbreak. Newsbreak, as you know, is the section under Rappler that does investigative stories, in-depth and fast fact stories, among others. For today's episode, we'll be talking about top topics, top stories for the month of February. If you've been reading Rappler, you're aware that these stories include the controversial frigate story, which got the president really riled up, and this was written by Carmela Fonbuena. We also have the Supreme Court controversy involving the Chief Justice, no less, and these stories were written by Lian Buwan. And we also have the Russian bots in Philippine online space. We're starting to feel their presence, according to Natasha Gutierrez, and of course the appointment of a non-librarian to the top post of the National Library of the Philippines, and that was written, or this was a documentary actually, put together by no less than Patricia Evangelista. So ladies, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We'd like, tell us about the stories. Why did you choose these stories, and why are they important? Let's start with you, Carmela.
Okay, I'll start. The Frigates Project is a story we followed since 2013 when the Department of National Defense opened the bid for 2 warships. It's important because, as we all know, we have a very long coastline, but we have the Philippines as one of the weakest militaries in Asia. So everyone's excited for 2 new warships that are expected to be delivered by 2020. What made it so urgent last month to write about it was what happened in December, when the Navy Chief, Vice Admiral Mercado, was ousted for supposed insubordination over the project. And because it's a huge deal, it doesn't happen, it's not been heard of, that you unceremoniously relieve
What is the reputation of Mercado, by the way?
He's well respected, and we can go back to the Senate hearing where Senator Lacson vouched for him. He's a professional soldier. And so it made us wonder what happened there. How can he commit insubordination? And this is something that we've heard about for a long time, that there were problems with the Frigates Project, but it was a difficult story. It's very technical. And it took us a while before we could understand what was happening in the project. But that single event, the unceremonious ouster of the Navy chief, raised a lot of questions, and that got us started.
What got the president's attention here?
Because we saw among the documents that we obtained meetings. There were documents showing there were meetings in Malacanang to discuss precisely what Vice Admiral Mercado was opposed to, the CMS that is supposed to be installed in the warships.
CMS?
The Combat Management System. It's a computer system that is said to be the brains or the heart of warships, because if you're out at sea, you need to know what's happening. If you're patrolling the waters, you need to know what other vessels are there threats?
Yeah.
So this is important because it integrates your weapons, your sensors. So this is the key question here in the project. What happened to this project? Back in the Senate, we've listened to the hearing, and everybody there, the senior Navy officers, agreed that they want a particular supplier for the CMS of the warships. But that's not what Hyundai, the shipbuilder, is planning to install.
This is Korean,
ships.
right?
This is the Korean company.
Right.
So what happened there? It raises a lot of questions because obviously we know that the former Navy chief fought for that system, and he was ousted for it.
Okay, so obviously here it's the controversy is really the supplier of that all-important CMS. We'll go back to that story later on. Let's jump to Lian. Just today, there have been a lot of stories about the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Sereno. Why is this story important when people don't really know about the Supreme Court or even goings on in the NBank?
I think that's what makes the story important, because people don't know the Supreme Court. People don't usually hear a lot of what happens inside those NBank sessions. So that's why the story is important, because it's a public interest and people want to know what happens there. It's important because it's the Chief Justice on trial.
Yeah.
It's the Supreme Court, a very secretive institution. And this comes at the time where women of the government are clashing with the president. He has had a word war with Chief Justice Sereno, with Ombudsman Conchita Carpio Morales, with Senator Leila de Lima. So it's very interesting to write about the circumstances around it.
There have been statements issued by both sides. You'd hear from the spokespersons, you'd hear from the Chief Justice, the justices themselves. Is this the first time that you have such open and blatant fight between among the justices?
This is definitely very unprecedented. This started when Justices Teresita Leonardo de Castro and Justices Noel Tiham and the other justices went to the House Justice Committee. The fact that they went to the House and openly testified, that is unprecedented. And the next things that happened just kind of unraveled before our very eyes. And yes, it's the first time it's happening. Sources tell us that this is not the first time that there are divisions inside the court, but not this open. Mm-hmm. They deal with it internally, they deal with it privately, and they've done so quite successfully in the past. So this is really the first time that we're seeing it unravel this way.
Okay, we'll go back to that later. Natasha, tell us about your Russian bots.
Sure. So fake news has obviously been a buzzword for the longest time. It's been a concern for all of us here, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world. So we have been following this. We had a propaganda series, a 3-part one. We had one of how bloggers influence information here. And then we started getting interested in Russia. Was there any Russia propaganda in the Philippines? So we started looking for trends, or we started noticing trends actually, starting with the tweet by WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange late last year, curiously about Rappler. So that in itself raised red flags. So since then we've been, keeping an eye out, noticing also and understanding that there was a growing alliance between President Rodrigo Duterte and the Russian government, not a secret. That alliance includes communications training for the PCOO. It was shown in the fact that the president visited Russia very early on in his presidency. So there were all these signs. And I think for us, what triggered this particular article was a specific bot that was written by Spanish newspaper El País, and the involvement of that bot in the Catalan elections. And the Catalan elections has been proven to have been intervened or interfered with by the Russian government. So that in itself was so interesting, especially because when we saw the bot, it had started tweeting about the Philippines. So
when did you notice the shift from Catalan to the Philippines?
It's hard to pinpoint the exact date of when it had started or it had transferred, but what we know about this bot was that the activity was numerous. It wasn't possible by a real person. The amount of tweets it was releasing, for instance. But I think the biggest thing, which Carmela had actually helped me realize, was that within 48 hours of the publication of our article, the bot was taken down. So it was suspended, which means it had violated Twitter rules. So that in itself was a huge sort of vindication. But again, even if that didn't happen, we knew it was something irregular, and we knew it was worth writing about.
But that was quick action on the part of Twitter, wasn't it?
Quick action part of Twitter, which also tells us a lot about what Twitter is doing to prevent this sort of activity. And so now we're waiting on Facebook to do the same.
Okay. Patricia.
Yes.
Why do a documentary about librarians?
Well, this is my first story in 18 months that did not involve tragedy or did not begin with a corpse on the street.
Yes.
But I am as interested in it because it's a function of perspective. It's an interesting narrative arc. A lone librarian accusing the president of violating the law. Last year, human resources officer from Davao City, who is not a librarian, was appointed the head of the National Library. It was in March, so there wasn't a lot of public condemnation. It wasn't very public at all.
Are there very specific requirements to be head of the National Library?
Yes, you have to have a master's degree. You have to be a registered librarian. And very few people understood that to be a librarian required passing the PRC test. So by the time January hit, although it's been spoken of in the communities of librarians, it was the director of the Ateneo Rizal Library who filed a complaint at the Ombudsman's office and demanded an investigation. So he wasn't just saying that this man should not be sitting in this position.
Yeah.
He was essentially saying that the President of the Republic has violated the law by appointing an unqualified individual into a position that requires qualifications.
Isn't it enough that you're a good manager, you read books? What's so special about the NLP?
Well, it is the National Library. It is the flagship of the library community. More than that, the law is very specific. It says that every librarian working in a government library should be registered.
Ah, so there's a law.
There is a law.
Okay.
However, the debate is whether or not the director should function as a librarian or as an administrator.
Okay.
There are people who say even before the law was implemented that there are eminent non-librarians who used to sit in the NLP regardless of whether or not they are registered librarians. The other argument is, regardless of the law, and I quote the Dean of the University of the Philippines School of Library Studies.
Yeah.
She said they wouldn't have complained if the person who was appointed even feigned interest in books.
So absolutely no interest in books here.
According to the individuals we interviewed who are librarians, who are registered, and as far as we could find, and it was difficult to find more about Cesar Gilbert Adriano, who was appointed into the National Library, we cannot find a background in library science that could stand.
Okay. You've been, I'm sure four of you have been working on diverse, different stories, but what was when you were working on these particular stories, what struck you? What was your moment of discovery, or maybe a great insight, something that you thought of which didn't hit you in the past stories that you worked on? Anyone?
Well, when I started writing the piece, again, it was triggered by the bot. But then when I started looking deeper, the parallelisms were so clear and so telling that as I was writing it, I was learning more and more about it. And that was what was exciting for me to write about, was to be able to share it to readers, especially those who are interested in disinformation and misinformation in the Philippines. To me, it's clear. There are very similar, very disturbing trends that are happening in the Philippines, techniques deployed by Russia that are very clearly here. Of course, it's a question of who is actually behind it. It could, that would be a much, that's a bigger problem to solve or a story to look into. But is there any question about the techniques being used here that is being used in Russia? Absolutely not. The bots are there. The Julian Assange is linked to the Kremlin for those, and many, surprisingly, netizens don't know this, but he is linked to Russia in many ways. One very clear link is that he is often quoted by Russian Today and Sputnik, which are Russian propaganda. I mean, these outlets never criticize the Russian government, are used for propaganda, and this is proven time and time again. So these things together make it very hard to ignore, and that's what was exciting for me to write about.
So if you were to do a follow-up story, what would be your next story?
Nice that you asked, because I am working on one. I am now looking at the Mueller indictment and seeing the techniques used in America, very clearly, again, Russian propaganda, and looking at the ways it was applied here as well. So again, if for now we cannot pinpoint where it is actually coming from, funding, it's so easy to find evidence that the techniques are here and that it's being used. So that
That's
alone,
scary.
I think, yes, it is scary. And I think the consequences are massive, and people don't understand that, because misinformation alone and disinformation alone that we're dealing with domestically is already bothersome and already convincing to so many Filipinos. What more when a country that has been doing information warfare for decades comes in and steps in? Are we ready for something like that? And honestly, it's disturbing, and I have my own thoughts about our preparation and our willingness, I guess, to open our mind to that. Because what was also surprising was the lack of awareness in in this possibility.
And there was information that the PCOO people or staff went to Russia for training?
Yes, there is a partnership between the PCO and the Russian government in terms of information dissemination training.
Okay.
Whether or not that the first tranche has already been done, I am not sure, but the fact even that our Philippine government is getting training from a country that has been known to spread propaganda and fake news is very, very disturbing.
That's a story in itself. I
Yes.
mean, what kind of training?
Right.
What was the content of that training? Who trained them? How much was spent and for how long?
There's your part 3.
Okay, any of you, what struck you when you were working on the stories?
For me, because I only began working in the Justice Beat last year, so
Yeah.
while I was working on the story, I realized that the division or the wounds, if I may say it, goes way back and it goes very deep, and that's what I've been discovering so far. Day by day, I discover something new about the relationships inside the court and the workings of the court. When the impeachment proceedings started, when Larry Gadon first announced that he was going to file an impeachment complaint, I kind of knew that it was going to get nasty at the House of Representatives. I mean, I knew that internal details were going to be divulged, but I didn't know that we were going to reach today that Sereno has been forced into a leave of absence and the 13 justices took a unified public stance that's unprecedented. So it's a continuing process of discovery for me, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Today, so many things happened. The Chief Justice has apologized, and this is what makes it exciting because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
What's scary there is, on the one hand, you see how fractious it has been in the court, but on the other hand, you see that if a weakened court is already being attacked, all the more as an institution, it's more vulnerable. So and in a democracy, I guess, if you have all these institutions very weak and you have the executive that's there, very, very strong, the checks and balances will not be working, right?
That's actually the one question that I wanted to ask Chief Justice when I got to interview her, because they stand to decide some of the biggest cases in the country. The petition to declare the war on drugs unconstitutional is still pending, and Solicitor General Jose Calida doesn't want to provide full documentation of the 3,000 deaths from the legitimate police operations, and that's still pending before the ANBAC. So, and there's the electoral protest of Marcos and the Robredo. So all eyes on the Supreme Court, how they're gonna decide these important cases, and the infightings have been exposed. So that's what I want. That's the one. If I could just ask one question, that's the one thing I asked her: if we can still trust the Supreme Court given all of this. And she told me that at least what we can trust is that the process is still there, that they are still discussing and they are still deliberating.
I suppose the justices who've been critical of her would also be criticized themselves, because by going out and being very public about the infighting, then they weaken the Supreme Court.
That's actually that's the sentiment that I keep reading on social media. People don't like that details of the ANBAC session last Tuesday have been revealed. They feel like it's a breach of confidentiality, but we realize now that it was important for us to report what happened from the ANBAC, because it turns out that there were discrepancies. And it led us to today, that the Chief Justice has apologized if there were information that were inaccurately conveyed. So I think it's important that we keep reporting what can be reported, as long as we trust that those information are accurate.
It's like a volcano, no? Waiting to erupt if it hasn't yet erupted.
Hopefully it doesn't erupt.
Yeah. Carmela.
Okay. The Frigates project, we followed 2 tracks here.
Yes.
We started with the question, what happened between the Philippine Navy and the Department of National Defense when they were trying to implement the project, because as we now know, there was an impasse on the CMS selection. So that's the first track. So the first aha moment was when we realized that there is no question that what the ousted Navy chief wanted was the proven technology. So if the CMS that he backed was actually a proven technology, how come the DND, the Defense Department, agreed that the supplier would install an inferior CMS? So that's the first question, because it's very technical. Before you can, we had to do interviews to be certain that the CMS of Tacticos Thales was actually the superior technology.
Tacticos Thales is
a Dutch.
It's a Dutch supplier.
And then the other track, of course, while we were trying to understand what happened in the acquisition project, that's when we found the documents and realized there was actually a meeting in Malacanang. And that by itself already raises a lot of questions. And that is also an aha moment. Why is there a meeting? And even after the Senate hearing, there were still a lot of questions that weren't answered about that meeting. So, two tracks. The other important finding we found out about this before, but it is confirmed in the Senate hearing, is that all the senior Navy officers actually prefer the CMS of Tacticos Thales over what the shipbuilder wanted to install. So these are categorical statements, even from the new Navy chief, that he still prefers the same CMS that the ousted Navy chief wanted for the ships.
What if Malacanang says, okay, we've hit a deadlock here. On the part of the Navy, there's disagreement about the supplier. So Malacanang says, I just wanted to bring them together so that, settle the issue. What's wrong with that?
But that's not what happened according to Malacanang. They said they called the Navy officers to explain what is the issue with the CMS selection, and supposedly there was no action. So that's the statement of Malacanang. But I guess the questions there too is, if Malacanang is aware that the Navy wants this particular CMS because it's superior, and they wanted this for what was envisioned to be the most modern warships of the Philippine Navy, why didn't they support the Navy position? That's also another question. Except Malacanang is saying they took no action. They had a meeting but took no action. And Sap Bongo said he had no knowledge about that meeting, and even Secretary Lorenzana said he only wrongfully assumed it came from Bongo. Again, because there were a lot of questions that weren't answered in the Senate probe, like who even went to Malacanang to complain? Was it the shipbuilder, Hyundai, which has a standing contract with the government for the two warships? Or was it the supplier, Hanwha? And if it's Hanwha, that raises another question. Why is a company with no standing contract with the government complaining in Malacanang? And what did they expect Malacanang to do? So these are the questions that would help clarify the issue. But I guess at this point though, because we've had all this Senate probe, what is clear to us and what we should focus on is, how do we move forward? Now that we realize that this is the superior CMS that the Navy wants, what are we going to do about it? There was a suggestion that the Philippines should agree to pay more, if only to
How much more?
It's $7 million for each CMS. So for two ships, that's about $14 million. I think it's 700 million pesos. It's gonna cost a lot, but we have to. How important are the ships for us? We are being challenged all over our waters. Benham Rise on one side, there's West Philippine Sea, and we have the terrorists in the waters of Mindanao. How important is it for us to have the equipped and modern warships? So is that a suggestion we're willing to consider? Because Secretary Lorenzana and Vice Admiral Mercado supported this proposal. Is that something that perhaps Malacanang can support? I don't know.
Have there been any new developments since you wrote the story?
Since last year, because of the impasse between the Navy and Defense Department, they were stuck with the critical design review. Because the acquisition of, the Navy is not buying bond papers here where you can just award a contract to a company and they'll supply you with the bond papers. The acquisition for frigates is more complicated. It's a 10-step process after the signing of the contract. And they were at stage 3, critical design review.
Okay.
This is the part where they will identify the shape of the hull, the angle of the hull, how many rooms, how big are the rooms, what is the CMS, what are the weapons. So they were at this stage when there was an impasse. And based on our interviews with defense officials, they haven't approved the CDR up to this point.
CDR is?
The critical design review.
Okay.
So they haven't moved forward. Although the Defense Secretary Lorenzana said it is already pushing through. So we don't know yet if the government has agreed to install Hanwha, the CMS of Hanwha, or is this something up for debate still?
And I guess the big question there, guys, does government have the $700 million?
Yes, that's another question.
Correct? Dollars, right?
700 million pesos.
Sorry, $700 million pesos. Yeah.
But it's a complicated debate because we're not talking about the CMS alone. There are other weapons that are being questioned, except we focus on the CMS now. But there are other issues in the frigates project.
That seems to be a very complicated,
Took us a while to understand.
Very technical, yeah.
Yes, it's very technical.
Pat,
Yes.
what was your aha moment?
Aha. Well, actually, it's less of an investigative story as it is a check on the pulse
Yeah.
of people who we did not expect would become part of the national spotlight, or at least will come out in protest against the president.
These are librarians. The public stereotype is a librarian keeps her peace
Yes.
inside the library. These librarians do not want to be seen as silent. And although the original narrative is a single librarian claiming that the president has violated the law, it's not just him. There are a number of librarians, many of them women, who do protest the appointment of someone who is not qualified into the position of director of the National Library. The reason they are offended: first, it's a violation of the law, according to them. But second, and more importantly, it is an insult to the profession. So there may be a variety of attacks against the government or against the president via the ICC, or criticism via the media, or a variety of other issues. There are also criticisms from different professions, and it is interesting to see if this cuts across the board. Their concern is that a number of librarians or people who are unqualified will be put in positions that they do not deserve, not just in the library, but in a variety of government institutions and in a variety of positions of power. I find that interesting. I also find their courage interesting. Regardless of whether I agree with them or not, it is a difficult time to be critical these days.
If you haven't yet watched the documentary of Pat, you should. It's under Newsbreak and it's entitled The Librarian.
It is a feature.
Yes, it is a feature and it runs for
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay.
Yes.
I remember one of the quotes, one of the sound bites there. This very feisty woman,
Yes.
and she said, the exact
She's
quote
an interesting
again?
woman. Her
Yeah.
name is Elvira Lapos. She is the deputy librarian of the University of the Philippines. She was very careful because she was the former president of the Philippine Librarians Association. So she will be careful to say she represents a multiplicity of ideas because quite a number of people support the president. However, she will also be clear, if you ask her personally, nakaka-insulto ang pag-appoint ng isang taong hindi kwalipikado sa National Library. She says it much better than I do, of course.
Nakaka-insulto, isang pambabastos.
Yes,
Tama?
isang pambabastos.
Yeah.
Dahil para sa kanila, kahit administrador ka lang, dapat naiintindihan mo ang mga pangangailangan ng mga librarian at mga tao na gumagamit ng isang library. Hindi daw kasi napapalitan ng Google ang library. Sa panahon ng fake news at sa panahon na ang daming sources ng impormasyon, lalapit ka sa librarian para sabihin, tanungin, hindi kung ano yung opinion mo dapat, pero ipakita sa inyo kung ano yung dapat nalalaman mo para gumawa ng opinion.
So I guess sa panahon nga ng fake news, lalo't lalong napakahalaga na mayroong kang librarian na naiintindihan yung trabaho niya at alam niya kung ano ang credible sources.
Yes.
Diba?
Absolutely.
Kung saan ka ituturo, whether libro yan or online source, kailangan meron siyang ganong expertise.
Yes. It is also very interesting that from what we are hearing and what we are seeing, although there's much we haven't validated yet, there are a number of appointees that may or may not be qualified for positions that they have been put in. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's just in this government. It could have been in the previous administration.
Yes.
It's an interesting narrative to see that it is the librarians who are protesting this. Very few people actually know that they need qualifications to become registered librarians.
That's true, yes.
Or a survey that was done recently, if you ask people, they don't know what the closest library is. So it is an eye-opener, I think. But more than that, it is an example of courage under fire.
And these are women, right?
These are women. Dr. Totanes is a man who has acknowledged his own bravery, but these are women who say, this is not about bravery. This is just about standing up.
So how do you see your stories or the issues involving your stories playing out in the near future or medium term? Ayan, ikaw. Exciting yung SC eh.
For me, ang unang-unang tanong ko, when does she come back from leave? Because
indefinite.
Because it's indefinite. And in the letter she sent to the Anne Bank on Tuesday night, she said, the indefinite leave is until I shall finish preparing for my trial at the Senate. Our sources tell us that what was agreed upon is that indefinite until the impeachment process is ended. So kailan? After she's done preparing or after matapos ang lahat? And then when she comes back, what happens when she comes back? Are we going to see another heated Anne Bank session forcing her to go on another indefinite leave? And supposing that she takes the whole impeachment process on leave and then she survives it and then she comes back, what happens next?
Wasn't there a period specified na from March 1 to March 15? Tama ba yun?
Kasi yung wellness leave niya has been prior scheduled from March 12 to March 23.
Okay.
So meron na siyang wellness leave talagang nakaschedule.
Earlier on.
Earlier on pa, dati pa. And then when after the Anne Bank discussion and it was agreed upon that she will be taking an indefinite leave, sinasabi niya dun sa letter niya that my 12 to 23 wellness leave, i-adjust niyo na from 1 to 15. Parang charge,
March 1 to 15.
Charge to my wellness leave na lang. Ganon. So, but when I was reading her letter and then the statement today of the 13 justices and our information, hindi malinaw when does she come back? After niyang prepare for trial or after matapos ang lahat. And that's just the short term. The long term, sobrang dami pa kasi magsi-Senate trial na. And I've been covering this impeachment proceeding since the first time that Larry Gadon said he would file. Hanggang ngayon, it's not clear to me what the main accusation is. Kasi sobrang dami. Every hearing day, may bago. And hearings last 11 hours, 12 hours.
And the last one ended at
11 p.m.
past
I
11?
think. Yes. And I'd also just like to point out na yung pinakamainit ngayon is the accusation that she didn't file all the necessary SAL-Ns. It was the tipping point, actually, of the justices. That's why they reached this point. But if you go back to the impeachment complaint of Larry Gadon, that wasn't specifically alleged. Larry Gadon said that the violation was that she didn't declare her entire Piatco fees in her SAL-N. He didn't say that she didn't file SAL-Ns as required by the JBC when she applied. So what is the accusation? How are the congressmen who are going to play prosecutors if they impeach Sereno? How will they write the articles of impeachment? What accusation are they gonna put forth to the Senate? What accusations are they gonna leave behind? Because so many, pati yung mga tawag ng SC official sa mga judges, pinag-usapan ng ilang oras. So it'll be interesting going to Senate kung ano-ano ba yung matatanggal na and what will be the focus of the impeachment trial.
Okay. Nat,
What's
next?
you we will see more of this. I think that...
Isn't it curious though? It's 2019 election year. And this is the year before elections. Do you see this as preparatory to more noise in social media as we approach 2019?
it would be hard to think otherwise. The Mueller probe shows that Russian propaganda in the US did not stop after Trump won.
Yeah.
In fact, what happened was they shifted their strategy to then create more divisions after he won. So they didn't just stop at putting Trump in power or helping put Trump in power, because in no way am I saying that that's the only reason he won, but there was a second phase to the propaganda, and that was to continue to divide America after the elections. And I think that anyone who has social media can definitely see the divisive nature of the discussions in the Philippines, the way that each political party or personalities are pitted against each other in an it's either you're with us or against us sort of narrative. So we're seeing that already. And it's only going to worsen leading up to the elections.
Can it be any more vicious than it is already today?
So
Imagine.
We Are Social just came out with the most recent study, and Filipinos spend the most time on the internet, on social media, in the world.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. Filipinos spend over almost 4 hours
More
a
than
day.
4 hours a day. A
day.
day.
And that is by far the most than any other country. Indonesia's the third. I need to make a special mention for that because they're seeing similar trends with us. But with that sort of statistic and this sort of environment, and social media platforms not doing enough, Facebook not doing enough and washing their hands off responsibility, it will only get worse. Unless, of course, the platforms do something about it, unless Filipinos get more digital literacy. And this is exactly why I thought this was important to write, was we need to make Filipinos aware of this problem so that they are able to find ways to combat it. If you're not aware of it, then how are you going to fight it? So I think rather than the pushback and the resistance of saying, that's a stupid article, in the words of Julian Assange, the stupidest article ever, that isn't the point, right? Thank you for paying attention to our articles. But that's not the point. The point is that this is happening and we need to be aware of it in order to be able to fight it.
Okay, so how do we push the stories forward? That's the last question.
For this one, it's a wait and see, because it's out of the hands. It's a protest video.
Will there be cases filed?
That is the question, because it's a complaint at the Ombudsman. The PRC and the Civil Service Commission is in meetings with each other. They're deciding whether or not the law applies to the director of the National Library, because it's easily argued that this is an administrative position. So it may or may not go somewhere. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think the larger issue is to look at other positions, other departments, and other places where qualifications may be relevant.
That's interesting, no? Because we really don't look at libraries.
No.
And there could be other more obscure
Yes.
government offices
Yes.
and agencies
Absolutely.
where they're doing this.
And obscurity does not mean we should not look. It just means it takes this one story for us to start looking elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So we start looking.
Yes. Carmela, how do we move forward?
Let's see if we can get answers to the questions being raised after the Senate probe. But more importantly, we will have to see if something can be done to get the Navy the CMS they want. Is there something we can still do with the situation we're in? So that's what we're going to look forward to.
Ian.
This is a very complicated story. So many, even just from the impeachment complaint, sobrang dami ng story ang pwedeng i-follow up because there are so many accusations. That they ended their last hearing last Tuesday is a very welcome wellness leave for the reporters covering this, because it gives us the
Leave for the reporters.
It's true.
because it gives us the
Wellness
time
leave.
to review all that has been alleged so far and see where we can follow up. For example, it's very interesting, at least to me, the digitization project of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The House hearing has been centered on whether or not was the consultant paid too much or was her hiring illegal. I want to know, is the project efficient?
Yes.
Are our courts digital? Are we actually seeing an implementation of an electronic court proceeding? Are litigants getting their notifications through their cell phones or their emails, which has been promised by Chief Justice? That's what I want to look at, among all the other things, and of course the relationships inside the Supreme Court. And one more is whether Chief Justice will attend personally the trial at the Senate. Dean Tony Lavinia, a legal expert, said that was Corona's biggest mistake when he was on trial. So we're all anticipating what Sereno would do.
Will she appear or not?
Will she appear or not?
When do you expect the Senate trial to begin?
It depends at the House of
When do they
Representatives.
decide, the House?
I think next week they will vote whether to impeach her or not.
Okay, you've been listening to our reporters. These are, we've been talking about the top Newsbreak stories for the month of February. Thank you, ladies, for joining this discussion. And we'd like to invite you to send us your suggestions and your tips for stories that you would want us to pursue, not only for March, but for the rest of the year. Send us your suggestions via email or send us your comments in the various stories that we've been doing. Thank you very much. This is Chai Hofilenya, and this is Newsbreak Chats.